I have to preface this video by saying that I might not have much of a point for making it at first. See, it's going to be a video all about the power of the first-person perspective. I'm going to explore where the concept originally came from, and eventually how it became so heavily integrated into our video games. But I'll also explore why there's a lack of this particular perspective in other visual mediums like film and television. And finally, I want to examine what it is that we overlook when it comes to enjoying our games in the first person. To answer why this style of game can be so much more engrossing to modern audiences. There's a combination of things that inspired me to talk about perspective for this video. For one, I recently purchased and played through the entire BioShock series in just 1 week. Thankfully, I had never had the game spoiled for me, so I was entering the worlds of Rapture and Columbia with a genuine sense of discovery. I'm not going to review the games here, but wow. They got me thinking about the absolute power of the first-person perspective. These games had a hold over me for almost 45 hours in total. After I finished, I delved into YouTube only to discover an unrelated rabbit hole of popular third-person games like The Witcher 3 and Watch Dogs that have since found a community of interest with first-person mods available on the PC. The comments on these videos cried out in only one direction. People loved this perspective, and they loved to see how it could alter and sometimes improve the experiences that they're already familiar with. This got me thinking about the titles that I wanted to see in the first person. Not to say they would be any better than their third person counterparts, but my curiosity is so rich that I would love to see a first person perspective of something as violent and horrific as The Last of Us Part 2. Or to witness the thump of Kratos' axe landing in his hand in a first-person God of War. Impacts become truly impactful in the first person, and that's because they're relevant to the only perspective we have ever known as humans with eyes. They give us an undeniable association with how we experience the real world around us. So yeah, swinging through New York as Spider-Man in the VR demo is a little unpleasant and, well, ugly. But what if Insomniac's Spider-Man game had the feature embedded within? And then imagine the rush of chasing down a train in Red Dead Redemption 2 in first... I had almost forgotten. See, since Grand Theft Auto 5 was ported to the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, developer Rockstar has actually committed heavily to the inclusion of a polished first-person perspective in two of the largest third-person franchises in video game history. I'm going to come back to Rockstar's inclusion of this new perspective, but first, let me just detour to the origins of the first-person viewpoint. The history is really interesting, and while we don't necessarily take these games for granted, we often don't think about the applications of this immersive perspective enough, or the history of it. When you think about it, the first-person perspective started a long time ago with simple storytelling, like words out of a mouth, person to person. I did this, I went here, I had this problem. And this style of dialogue has existed, well, probably forever. Then literacy came along. Books stemmed and flourished in both popular perspectives of third and first person, but the first person perspective was utilized as a way to enter the character's psyche and understand their thoughts through the words on the paper. For many people, hundreds of years ago, it might have been quite a surreal glimpse into the mind of a character to read a book like this. And that sensation for people then might be similar to our first experiences with virtual reality today. A type of new first-person technology that is currently unparalleled for our time. Anyway, back to the history lesson. For a very long stretch of human history, the first-person perspective was pretty much only reserved for books and novels. When television and film developed a need for narration and voiceover, we had another entry of first-person type storytelling, although again, this is not a visual implementation of the perspective.
I was sheriff of this county when I was 25 years old. Hard to believe. Grandfather was a lawman, father too. Me and him were sheriffs at the same time, him up in Plano and me out here. I think he's pretty proud of that.
Oddly enough, the first-person perspective as a visual tool is so rarely used in cinema at all. I think that's because video games have instilled it with such a sense of control. Sometimes this control takes the form of Western RPGs like Skyrim, allowing characters to become truly your own customizable and moral decision makers, just molding clay for your role-playing desires. Whereas in other first-person game series like Far Cry, the perspective works instead to heighten the impact of the more confined storytelling implemented in these narratives, working to pull you deeper into both the main character's reactions to the story, which are normally out of your control, as well as the intensity of moment-to-moment gameplay. In cinema, there's a total lack of control. No decision-making, no sense of being inside a character unless the aforementioned narration is used. Therefore, the first-person perspective doesn't have the same implications on the silver screen. That was until 2015's Hardcore Henry tried to spin off from the trend of massively popular first-person shooter games, as the film emulated the video game-like style in one all-encompassing motion picture event. However, for the first-person perspective to arrive in video games, it probably wasn't until 1973, when a group of high school students on a NASA work-study program were trying to develop software to help visualize fluid dynamics for spacecraft designs, when they strangely ended up developing a video game called Maze War instead. The perspective invented by these high schoolers eventually made its way to MIT, where it was further developed into an 8-player version, including online scoreboards, customizable maps, a spectator mode, and even AI players. Initially, the perspective was hilariously named the Rat's Eye View, because it simulated the perspective of a rat caught in a maze. From there, the first-person perspective only grew bigger in scope. The US Army eventually picked it up in the late 1970s for an internal tank simulation software, before the same style of game was replicated for consumers as Battlezone, playable on arcade machines in the early 80s. Skip by a decade and what you've got is often branded as the mother of first-person shooters, Wolfenstein 3D. I'm going to stop the first-person history lesson here because what follows is kind of common knowledge. The technology grew big time, and games like Quake, GoldenEye, Half-Life, and Halo created a desire for more. And finally, we've reached the heights of today, where third-person games are adding in alternative perspectives. Why? Not for money, not as DLC, but purely to cater for those of us that enjoy a particular style of immersion. When I first played Grand Theft Auto 5 at age 14, I beat the game in 3 days and achieved 100% in just 4. I played it over and over and over again. When it finally arrived on the PlayStation 4, I played it entirely in first person for the first time, and an experience that I previously would have been able to complete with my eyes closed became an entirely new game to me. Jump forward to 2020, and I'm currently experiencing this very same sensation with a full second playthrough of Red Dead Redemption 2 in first person. And I highly recommend revisiting the game in this ultra-visceral way. It staggers me how appropriate both perspectives can be for this title alone, and it teases me about the opportunities that could be afforded to other predominantly third-person titles with the right care taken. That's why my recent time with BioShock put the growth of this genre into perspective, and showed me the developments that could be made by just one studio over the span of an entire series of characters, concepts, and ideas. It also sparked a totally new realization in me, maybe one that you've yet to realize yourself. See, as far as I can tell, there's only one other unique instance of the first-person perspective outside of books, film, and video games. It's an odd one, not one you'd ever associate with this topic. It's theatre. That's not to say the audience's perspective of theatre is in the first person, which it definitely is not, but rather the experience of the actors themselves. See, actors, and especially those on stage, have a rare position of narrative control when playing a character. They're confined by a series of rules, scripts, motions, and predetermined actions, yet still, they're embodying the experience of being someone else, thinking like someone else, all in the first person, if only for them. It's a little bit like BioShock. Now, the way that I look at first-person games, I can't help but imagine that I'm performing as someone else. As me, as someone else. As a version of me, maybe not even me, but still encompassing the character wholly. When you're playing in the third person, I suppose you could say that you're closer to directing an actor than being one. In control of them from afar, but when you're inside their head and their eyes, you are closer to being a performer than any book or piece of cinema can emulate. And as the well-versed high school actor I was myself, I can vouch personally for how addicting this encompassing sensation can be. The first-person perspective in word-of-mouth, literacy, film and television, video games, and now in virtual reality has proven itself to be the foundation of some of the most immersive experiences to date. I'm lucky enough to own a PlayStation VR system, and I've recently started playing a game called The Walking Dead: Saints and Sinners. I can honestly say I've never had more control than I do right now. I've never acted like this before. An invisible prop fills my hand, but finally to my eyes I see a blade, a bottle, a gun. My imagination runs wild, not by the confines of a stage, but by what has been staged mere inches from my eyes. This VR title is not only the best I've played yet in my fairly limited VR experience, but it and other titles like Red Dead Redemption 2 now all trend toward a future in which first-person perspective becomes normality.
I may not always love you, but long
as virtual reality grows and augmented reality blossoms, as the decades that once passed between the technology of the 1970s and 80s will now pass between the 20s, 30s, and 40s of the 21st century, many of us will witness the brink of the new age of first-person video games. A new age of selfish, isolated, indulgent acting. I'm personally excited for the journey, to have empathetic experiences with myself, otherworldly experiences, violent, peaceful, exciting experiences at my fingertips. As discovery in our video games becomes more like reality, we, the human race, will eventually toe the line between what is real and what is simulated in our first-person perspectives. Virtual reality creates as scary of a future as it is enticing, but not to worry about that. We live in the present now, and we've got the ability to witness world-class stories from an evolving and deeply personal perspective. Take your time in these worlds. View them like they're your own. Walk slowly and with purpose. Explore with a sense of realism, because maybe one day you might not be able to tell the difference.
God only knows what I'd be without you.
Thank you for watching my video. This is only the second in what I hope to be a long series of video essays about games, cinema, and anything like it that interests me. I'm a New Zealand-born film director, currently living on a work permit in the United States, a country in which it is nearly impossible for me to find work in my field right now. These videos have allowed me to channel my interests into something that can hopefully teach people as well as entertain. But if there's one thing you could do to help sustain my ability to do this, it would be first to subscribe, and secondly, to head over to my newly set up Patreon account. Any amount you could contribute to the production of these videos would help see me through real-world costs. There should be a link down there in the description, otherwise I look forward to serving you more content in the near future.